Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and frankly, quite a disturbing paradox that's found within our source material. It's about the profound physical depletion experienced by adults who have achieved, these impressive levels of self-control, specifically what the text calls dietary mastery, yet find their health just completely compromised when they're forced into systemic environments that restrict their choices.
Right, and we're talking about lives really subjected to mandated protocols, restrictive housing, financial instability, all these constraints you see in certain mental health recovery settings or, well, in many marginalized communities.
Exactly. The source material really wraps this up with a potent phrase: hypocrisy under constraint. So these are individuals who consciously understand the ethics, the mechanics of good nutrition, yet the system forces them to act against that knowledge. The question isn't if their health declines, we know it does, but why?
And that is the core of it. So the central question for us today is this. Is this severe physical health depletion, the fatigue, the metabolic imbalance, all of it, is it primarily driven by the internal moral and psychological dissonance that this hypocrisy creates? Or is it simply the direct physiological burden of the chronic, unrelenting systemic stress itself?
A perfect framing. I'll be arguing that the direct physical strain of this chronic external control is the primary causal agent of the health decline. I mean, the body simply breaks down from the constant fight or flight state induced by the system, which makes the internal moral conflict a secondary, albeit very painful symptom.
And I'm going to contend that the internal dissonance, that conscious awareness of ethical and behavioral misalignment, that's what acts as the critical mechanism that mediates the physical harm. It's the conflict between their achieved mastery and their forced failure that really weaponizes the systemic stress.
Okay, so let's start with this whole premise of dietary mastery, because we aren't just talking about, having good intentions here. We're discussing individuals who have invested immense cognitive and emotional labor into regulating portions, timing, nutrient density, quality of food. I mean, it's a massive achievement of self-efficacy.
Huge.
So when systemic pressures, like rigid institutional schedules or severely limited food access, prevent them from upholding that mastery, the harm is unique. The source notes this dissonance is morally and psychologically significant. This is more than general stress. This is the conscious violation of a self-chosen, deeply internalized code. That intentionality they possess, it becomes, as the text says, weaponized by systemic pressures. And that psychological tax, the guilt, the anxiety, the sense of identity fragmentation, that translates directly into measurable physical decline through chronic stress pathways.
That recognition of moral injury is, well, it's undeniably powerful, but I think it relies on the internal calculus as the primary driver. I still maintain that the physical constraints are the foundational problem. They compromise health before the moral interpretation even really has time to register. I mean, the systemic burden, chronic financial precarity, housing instability, the lack of control over basic daily routines, that is a profound brute force physiological stressor. The source clearly shows that prolonged external control, it compromises executive function directly. So when the body is perpetually in survival mode because of these environmental pressures, cortisol regulation is impaired, digestion falters, sleep quality degrades. This constant physiological wear leads directly to metabolic imbalance and fatigue. The body and brain, they just adapt to survive in these constrained environments by compromising non-essential functions. And that includes the capacity for highly regulated self-control. The physical exhaustion is inevitable, really, regardless of the individual's moral feelings about their diet.
I appreciate the focus on the physiological inputs, I do. But the source makes such a compelling argument for the mediator here. The physical symptoms, the disrupted digestion, the cognitive decline, reduced resilience, they're not just correlated with systemic stress. They are explicitly linked to the stress generated by the conscious awareness of this misalignment. For those who have attained mastery, that mastery just elevates the stakes. Their cognitive discipline makes the violation of their values painfully apparent every single time they are forced to make a suboptimal choice. Think of it as a kind of intellectual sunk cost. They achieve this high state of internal consistency, And seeing that achievement repeatedly dismantled by external forces is just far more taxing than it is for someone who perhaps never achieved that level of internal discipline. The core depletion is rooted in the shattering of that self-integrity.
See, the issue I have with prioritizing the internal integrity is that it risks overlooking the immediate neurobiological impact of the environment. When someone faces chronic systemic oppression, let's just use the example of being forced into restrictive housing, where kitchen access is severely limited or just non-existent. The stress response isn't waiting for a moral evaluation. The brain, prioritizing compliance and emotional survival over internal consistency, physically suppresses the ability to pursue those nuanced internal goals. This prolonged external control leads directly to a measurable neurobiological impact. The constraints don't just trigger cognitive dissonance, they impose an external, non-negotiable chemical reality on the body. If you are exhausted from chronic, unstable sleep due to environmental noise or rigid schedules, your brain simply cannot marshal the resources for the high-level executive function required for dietary mastery, even if your conscience is, screaming about it. We are discussing a failure of physical capacity enforced by the system, not merely a failure of moral will. And this brings us to recovery, which I believe really strengthens my case for the direct physiological model. Recovery modules, they primarily succeed by restoring choice and actively reducing systemic stress, which in turn physiologically lowers chronic cortisol levels and supports digestion and sleep. The source even describes neurobiological repair occurring when agency is restored. This puts the emphasis squarely on recovering neurological and physical function. By granting concrete agency over daily routines, allowing someone to finally control when and what they eat, you address the physiological depletion directly. The reduction in the systemic threat turns off the chronic stress response, allowing the body to heal. The repair is physical, metabolic, and neurological first.
I agree that restoring choice is absolutely necessary, but let's look at why the source says choice matters. If the depletion were purely physiological, simply removing the stressor might be enough. But the source insists that the power of recovery lies in aligning action with internal values and rebuilding trust in their judgment. This suggests the deepest damage was actually the loss of that internal integrity. So the ultimate reversal of depletion happens when they restore moral consistency, the ability to act consistently with their conscience and their master discipline. When the person can resume their dietary mastery, they are resolving the hypocrisy. This internal consistency is what fundamentally stabilizes the chronic stress pathways. The physical repair follows, or is at least deeply intertwined with, the resolution of the self-betrayal imposed by the system.
But doesn't that alignment of values often become possible only after the chronic physiological strain has been reduced? The body has to have the physical and neurological reserves to implement that mastery. If I am critically sleep-deprived and experiencing severe metabolic disruption because the system controls my schedule, my capacity to act ethically or in alignment with my values is compromised regardless of my belief system. The system strips away the physical capacity for ethical action. It seems to me that the environment must first allow for physical healing through stability, consistent sleep, genuine access to resources, before the moral self can fully reintegrate.
Let's maybe consider the terminology itself. I believe the source's strategic use of the word hypocrisy is deliberate and powerful. It highlights the structural damage not just to the body, but to the self, when capacity and freedom are compromised. It captures the sheer intensity of the internal tension experienced by these peers who possess a high level of conscious awareness because of their mastery. If we only talk about stress or physiological wear, we risk blurring the distinction between this situation and just general burnout. The term hypocrisy, despite its charged nature, captures that this internal conflict is distinct. It attacks self-realization and identity. It's the violation of a self-chosen discipline that makes the depletion so acute.
I get the desire to convey the emotional intensity. I really do, but I find the term highly problematic. And it's problematic precisely because the source material is so meticulous in stating that this is not ethical failing in the traditional sense and not a voluntary contradiction.
Right.
The source even draws on frameworks that suggest being compelled to act by systems beyond your control does not equate to moral condemnation. So given that crucial caveat, using the charged term hypocrisy risks misdirecting the focus. It inadvertently places undue weight back onto the psychological state of the individual instead of unequivocally blaming the concrete, measurable environmental constraints, the financial limitations, the inadequate housing, the rigid schedules that are the true, measurable causes of the physical breakdown.
My point is that the effect of the constraint is experienced as hypocrisy by the mastered self, regardless of whether it's a voluntary moral failure. It's the cognitive machinery saying, I know the right thing to do, I have the skill to do it, yet I am systematically forced to do wrong. This is why the source speaks of the depletion of moral and ethical energy. If we just replace hypocrisy with a neutral term like structural misalignment, we lose that unique insight into the moral suffering that acts as an amplifier of the physical stress. The mind is a powerful engine for depletion when it's consciously forced to fight itself.
But if we're looking for an actionable intervention, focusing on the system's role is critical. If we use a term like constrained action or structural coercion, we immediately point to the need for systemic change, better housing options, flexible schedules, accessible nutrition. If we emphasize the internal hypocrisy, the risk is that the solution could be misdirected toward purely psychological interventions, like therapy to manage guilt, rather than addressing the material conditions that are physically dismantling the person's health. The measurable outcomes, cortisol levels, metabolic health, are tied to the physical environment. We have to address the environment first to restore physiological viability.
Well, I'm not suggesting we ignore the environment. The environment is obviously the catalyst, but the mechanism that takes that catalyst and turns it into acute physical depletion is internal. Think about two individuals under the same constraint, one who has mastered their diet and one who hasn't really paid much attention to it. The master suffers a greater degree of internal and physical depletion because the betrayal of their self-mastery is more profound. This suggests the high cognitive and ethical awareness is what accelerates the physiological decline. The depletion is maximized when the structural oppression targets an area of established self-identity and competence.
That assumes the non-master isn't suffering equally from other forms of systemic stress. The person without dietary mastery is likely dealing with the same financial precarity, the same housing instability, the same sleep deprivation, which causes metabolic imbalance through the exact same physiological pathways, just perhaps without the specific overlay of dietary guilt. We have to remain focused on the common denominator of physical stress imposed by external control. The system dictates survival mechanisms, and survival under these conditions is physically exhausting, regardless of how finely tuned one's moral compass is.
Ultimately, what the source material compels us to examine is a complexity of integrity under pressure. And while environmental constraints are the necessary catalyst, they provide the force. I still believe the most severe depletion of physical health is intensified and maintained by that internal contradiction. It is the conscious suffering of ethical dissonance when one's mastered discipline cannot be enacted due to structural oppression. The restoration of moral alignment and agency, the ability to live consistently with one's conscience, that's the key to restoring vitality and reversing the physiological damage.
And my position remains that the systemic imposition of external control, financial instability, and institutional rigidity is the direct cause of physical degradation, leading to compromised executive function and metabolic imbalance. The internal conflict is a painful, unfortunate consequence, but it is not the core mechanism driving the physical decline. Recovery has to prioritize addressing those environmental and physical barriers to restore fundamental resilience and physiological function, allowing the body and brain the stability they need to heal.
The interaction between agency, ethics, environment, and physical health, especially in context of scarcity and constraint, it really demonstrates a deeply nuanced relationship between our inner moral world and our physical biology.
Yeah, and understanding exactly how these constrained conditions impact both the body's resilience and the individual sense of self is critical for truly supporting recovery and building lasting resilience in the face of these systemic challenges. There is clearly much more to explore in how all these forces converge.